I'm Evan Feigenbaum, the Vice President for Asia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And this is one chapter in a multi-part video series on 6 crises and how the United States and China, despite their considerable strategic rivalry and geopolitical tension, managed to coordinate. We're talking today to Hank Paulson, the former American Secretary of the Treasury who presided over the American response to the financial crisis of 2008. Which could have tipped the world into the worst global catastrophe since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Despite considerable US-China tension at the time and a lack of trust, he coordinated closely with the government in Beijing. And we talked to him about why he did so, how he did so, what was hard, what was easy, and above all, what lessons he learned from that experience that might be relevant to decision makers today who are working to deal with the pandemic of the coronavirus known as COVID-19. Here's what he told us.
Although the 2008 financial crisis originated in the United States and Europe, we needed to talk frequently with China, communicate with them frequently, and then eventually coordinate with them for two major reasons. First, China was a huge holder of U.S. securities, U.S. Treasury bonds, and the securities issued by our two very large mortgage insurers, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who insured, collect between them, over half of residential mortgages in the United States. And Chinese entities also held a lot of corporate securities. And so it was important to communicate with them so that they didn't get discouraged or become so concerned that they dumped or sold U.S. securities, precipitating a panic-driven run on the banks or accelerating a panic-driven run on the banks. And secondly, we were dealing with China, which was the second largest economy in the world, the fastest growing major economy in the world, a big exporter to the United States, the fastest growing export market for the United States, and a big driver of a global economic activity. So they had a vital interest in knowing what was happening in the financial markets in the United States. In 2008, this was a tense, troubled relationship. It was a difficult relationship. In the economic arena, the two toughest areas of contention were the way that the Chinese managed their currency. It was undervalued, and we were pressing China to revalue their currency and appreciate it. And secondly, there were huge global imbalances, and China had very big imbalances in that they saved much more than they consumed. And so those are the two biggest areas of contention. The U.S. relationship with China politically was also tough. Any anti-China bill that went to the U.S. Congress would have passed unanimously. President Bush at the time knew we needed a stable relationship with China, and he had a solid relationship, not a great relationship, but a solid relationship with his counterpart, President Hu Jintao. And when I came on and joined his administration in July of 2006, he asked me to lead and coordinate the economic relationship with China. And he asked me to do this because I spent a lot of time in China, and I didn't just know, but I had a close working relationship with a number of the Chinese leaders. The man who would eventually be my counterpart in China, Vice Premier Wang Qishan, had worked with me closely on doing some of the most important restructurings of state-owned enterprises in China, public offerings for those state-owned enterprises. I'd worked very closely also with Zhou Xiaotren, who was head of the central bank in China. I knew Hu Jintao, the president, quite well through my work with his alma mater, Tsinghua. And when he visited, for instance, when he visited New York after 9/11 to attend the UN meetings that December, I accompanied him on much of the trip and accompanied him when he laid the reef at ground zero. So, I had a relationship, and the device I used to manage the relationship, the economic relationship, was a strategic economic dialogue, which is very results oriented, but we constructed it so that it worked effectively with China's decision-making process, which was a consensus-driven process where many officials, leaders need to be involved in major decisions, and often those with the most influence were the ones that didn't have titular responsibility. So we met twice a year, and this really was very fortunate that we had this SED up and going for almost a year before the crisis hit, because that meant that many of the key people in the United States, the key economic leaders in the administration, had very comfortable relationships with their Chinese counterparts. Which I admired greatly about President Bush. He knew this relationship was politically toxic, and he knew that no politician ever got elected by saying positive things about China. But he knew how important this was for global stability, for peace, for global security. He had a great understanding of China. Part of it came from his father, who had been an ambassador in China and also understood the importance of this relationship. So President Bush gave me good political advice, but he encouraged me to work to find common ground with China and to make progress on the tough economic issues with which we were dealing. So the financial crisis hit in late summer or the summer of 2007. And early on, what we were doing was just communicating frequently with the Chinese. And the nature of the communication was just explaining what problems we were encountering and what we were doing to address those problems. And, the description of the problems and what we're doing to address the problems changed as the situation worsened. And the nature of the communication leading to coordination became much more frequent and necessary beginning in March of 2008, at the time when we needed to step in and prevent the failure of the investment bank Bear Stearns. And from that time on, it was particularly important that we encourage the Chinese to understand how important we thought it was that they continued to show confidence and deal with our banks and investment banks, encourage them to continue to hold the securities issued by banks and investment banks. And a huge part of the focus was on these mortgage giants, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who had $5.4 trillion in securities outstanding, $1.7 trillion outstanding outside of the U.S., and China was the biggest holder of those securities outside of the U.S. And so it was very important they continued to hold those securities, and there was concern all around the world because the United States did not back the United States government did not back the credit of those securities. And so this was a cause of real concern. And particularly, beginning in early July of 2008, when Fannie and Freddie began to implode, and I needed to go to Congress and seek emergency authorities to prevent a failure, I was spending time dealing with Congress during the day and calling my counterpart Wang Qishong in the evening, explaining what we were doing and encouraging him to continue to hold those securities. And it took great courage for the Chinese to do this because they had lost a lot of money through some of their investments in U.S. financial institutions and in the value of U.S. securities. And they were being criticized politically for having, losing Chinese treasure, their foreign their exchange reserves, and so there was great criticism they were getting, and so again it took a lot of communications to get the Chinese to continue to hold those securities. And then in August of 2008, right after we got those emergency authorities, and when I was in Beijing for a few days for the Chinese Olympics, I had a Chinese official take me aside, a very senior Chinese official who was a good friend of mine, took me aside and confided in me that the Russians had approached them and encouraged them to join with the Russians to start selling Fannie and Freddie securities in order to force us to immediately exercise our emergency authorities. And this was at a time before we understood the full extent of the problems in Fannie and Freddie. We had the auditors in taking a very careful look, and we hadn't developed a plan yet to deal with them. So this took my breath away, and we were doing everything we could to accelerate a plan to nationalize those institutions, and the fact that the Chinese, held firm and continued to hold those securities gave us the time we needed to nationalize Fannie and Freddie and do it in I think, an effective and elegant way. The third incident or event I would cite came in November of 2008. After the election, and after we made real progress in stemming the panic on U.S. financial institutions, and the Europeans have made some real progress there, President Bush needed to hold a meeting of global leaders to deal with the response to the crisis, the aftermath, and what we needed to do to get the global economy running again. And there was a lot of discussion in terms of what was the best group. There was a lot of sentiment in Europe that the right group would be a G7 or a G8 group, which was largely our European allies, Japan and Canada. And there were some of us that believed, as I think President Bush believed, that it would be better if we had a more representative group based on a G20 group, which was a group of finance ministers that met once a year. And this was composed of some of the bigger developing economies like China and India. But there was real concern that it would be hard to get a consensus out of that group. The problem was largely a European and US problem, and that some members of the G20, like Argentina, where Cristina Fernandez was not a real friend of the US, to put it mildly, might create problems and wouldn't favor market-based economics. And so the president deputized me to get to the Chinese very quickly and to determine how constructive and positive they would be, and would they show some real leadership if they were part of a G20 leaders meeting. And so I called Wang Qichong, and within 24 hours they got back and gave us all the assurances we needed. And so when that meeting was held in mid-November after the election, was a very effective meeting. The G20 came together and reaffirmed their belief in market-based economic principles, which was particularly important. They came out very strongly against protectionism and the kind of beggar thy neighbor trade policies we saw after the Great Depression. And one of the other things we emphasized was the need for a global stimulus. And it was very, very effective that China in early 2009 unleashed a major stimulus program, fiscal stimulus program, which they've been paying for a long time. It created huge problems within China, but it helped power the global economy and drive us, out of the Great Recession and back to global growth again. The easy part of this was the frequent communications, because we'd had the SED. We were used to talking. I knew my Chinese counterparts. We could schedule a meeting in a few hours' notice. They did it at whatever time would be convenient for us. And so we had candid, blunt conversations. And they always trusted and knew that we were telling them the truth as we understood it at the time. We were telling them what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And that worked well. The difficult part was made easier by the fact that we communicated frequently. But the difficult part was they didn't have a good understanding of our political system, and some in the US didn't really understand their political system. And so it was very, very difficult for them to watch this spectacle going on of Congress trying to beat my brains out during the day when I'm up there publicly looking for the authorities to stabilize Fannie or Freddie, and then getting on the phone at night and say, well, listen, that doesn't mean anything. That's just the way our political system works. Trust me, at the end, we'll all come together and this will get done. And so explaining those sorts of things were difficult, but we did it. Another explanation, and I need to give I'll give an anecdote for that also, which was right after Lehman Brothers failed, during the toughest period we had in the United States, when our whole system was beginning to melt down and the panic was going full force. We had a situation where one of the money market funds, which held Lehman Brothers commercial paper, began to implode, because the Lehman Brothers commercial paper seemed very worthless at the time. Now, money markets in the United States had $3.8 trillion of funds, and there are 30 million Americans invested in these money market funds. And these money market funds were the biggest buyers of commercial paper issued by the big US companies. And so when the run started on the money markets, big companies couldn't issue their paper. They wouldn't very quickly have been able to pay their suppliers, and the crisis would have moved very quickly from Wall Street to Main Street. So right in the middle of this, I got word when I came in early in the morning that Chinese banks and entities were dumping US corporate securities and commercial paper on their investment and money market funds. And so I immediately said, let's get on the Chinese and tell them to stop it. And some people at Treasury said, you can't do that. I mean, what would have happened if US banks were selling Chinese securities? No one could call us. The government can't keep banks from selling securities in the United States. But I said, listen, this is China. Trust me, we can get to them. And we got to the head of the central bank, Zhou Xiaotren, and the selling stopped just like that. Bingo. And that gave us time to come up with a plan where we used a fund that the Treasury had to guarantee the money markets and avoid the crisis. So the easy things were getting on the phone and communicating. The difficult things were the differences in political systems. As I think back to the 2008 financial crisis, there are three major lessons that come out of that experience that I think were not only applicable then, but are applicable today. The first one is the Chinese don't like surprises. Their system works best when there's a predictability and there is constant communication. Constant communication when there's good news, when there's bad news, when there are things that are unpleasant, talking to them regularly. And so we communicated with the Chinese frequently. And when the situation changed and we were wrong, we said, listen, the situation is changing. We were wrong about this. We have to do something different. So direct communication. And that's true today. It was true then. The second lesson is that a good part of our power to influence, our credibility, comes from the strength of our economic system and how our economic model is perceived. And during the financial crisis, when our financial system was rightfully discredited and was a source of problems which hurt the United States and the whole world, our credibility was eroded. My trust wasn't eroded because the Chinese knew that I was being candid with them and explaining things. And as the facts changed, or as my understanding of the facts changed, giving them the straight picture. But our credibility was eroded. And when I tried to push them to do certain things like opening up their own financial system, my counterpart in Washington said, "Wait a minute, Hank, you were our teacher. And our teacher doesn't seem so smart today." And so you see very quickly how important it is to have a strong financial system and be dealing with the Chinese from a position of strength. And I think that's true very much today. I would say the third lesson is, I think it's unreasonable to expect the Chinese to do anything that isn't in their interest. And now there are plenty of things that are in our mutual interest. And it's often very difficult to persuade someone to do something that's going to be politically unpopular in China or in the US, but is in our mutual interest. And during the financial crisis, some of the things they did were very unpopular in China, but it was in their interest. And so it was not in their interest to dump U.S. securities because they were a big holder in U.S. securities, and they would have lost a lot of money if they dumped those dumped securities. So we were able to persuade them to hold U.S. securities and to be very, very responsible counterparties. But when I tried to persuade them to do things that weren't in their interest, which I did once, they immediately said, "No way." So right after we got the authorities from Congress to stabilize Fannie and Freddie, I said to them, "Now that we've got these authorities, it would be very helpful if you not only held what you've got, but start buying a lot more. That would help the prices go up, it would help you, it would help all of us." And they said, "No way. This is your problem. You buy more. The US government should buy more. We'll hold." And so, again, don't expect them to do something. The trick is to convince them to do something that is in their interest, because it's and in our mutual interest. And I think that's still very relevant today. If we can't cooperate on huge global issues of which make a big difference to the United States, China, and the world, like the pandemic, the world is going to be a very, very dangerous place. And as I think back to the 2008 financial crisis and then what we're going through today, the one overwhelming lesson is that the world is a smaller and smaller and more interconnected place. And just as financial contagion and economic issues don't stop at national boundaries, they are truly global. Obviously, the virus is not a respecter of national boundaries. So there's a huge need to cooperate when it's in our mutual interest. And it just is so clear to me, if we look at a range of issues in terms of everything from dealing with nuclear proliferation or combating terrorism or the pandemic, which we're dealing with right now, or how do we maintain a framework to sustain global economic growth, it is critically important that we find a way to work to our mutual advantage. I see this very clearly, and I've always been an optimist. And my view is this is far from over. unfortunately. And so there's plenty of time for us to coordinate with China on dealing with the pandemic. And we're going to have to coordinate to protect the health of Americans and Chinese, and to really protect, the economic security of the United States, China, and the world. So there's a great need to do it, and I'm convinced we're going to need to do that, and I haven't given up hope yet. And the message that I give when anybody asks me for advice today is, look, I recognize this isn't the China that I dealt with in 2008. This is a different China. It's a different United States. It's a different world. This relationship is spinning out of control. It's a very different relationship. But communication is more important than ever. In issues where we have, and in issues where we have strong differences, and we don't agree with each other, and we're strategic competitors, it's very important to have difficult communications to avoid conflict, which is going to benefit any of us. And then in areas where we have a mutual interest, like protecting the environment. And heck, I look at this and look at the way man has been plundering the environment and cutting down the tropical forests and crowding out nature. In many ways, the pandemic is nature's way of fighting back. The wildlife trafficking and all the things that have been going on that aren't good with the environment. We're dealing with climate change. We're dealing with nuclear proliferation, or any of the difficult issues we're talking about. There, we need to find common ground. And we need to find common ground, or the world, as I said, is going to be a very dangerous and very difficult place. And so I look at this as being essential.